Welcome to the Three Things Podcast. I'm David Iglesias, Director of Wheaton Center for Faith, Politics, and Economics. You may be wondering why this podcast is called Three Things. You were probably taught by your parents, like I was, that it was impolite to talk to people about three things: religion, politics, and money. But what happens if your job is to talk about those three things? Well, let's find out. Jonathan Phillips is Vice President of Imaging Science at Imatest, a leading company in image quality testing based in Boulder, Colorado, that supports camera development for many of the world's top companies across numerous industries, including automotive, mobile electronics, security, aerospace, and medical imaging. Prior to joining Imatest, he was a leader of image quality at Google's Android organization from 2015 to 2021. Particularly focused on the Google Pixel camera and display image quality. His experience in Silicon Valley has also included managing the camera image quality lab at NVIDIA, where his work centered on optimizing the Tegra chip ISP for smartphone cameras from 2012 to 2015. Jonathan worked at Kodak from 1990 to 2012 as a key player in the photography transition from analog to digital, switching from chemical processing in the darkroom, I remember that, to working on digital imaging devices and printers. Kodak sponsored his master's and PhD work in color science at Rochester Institute of Technology's Munsell Color Science Laboratory. He's a 1992 graduate of Wheaton College, where he received his BS in chemistry. Jonathan, thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you, David. It's an honor to be part of your blog.
Well, I have to tell you, I have read about Kodak. I've never actually interviewed anyone who worked at Kodak, so I'll get to that in a while. But you've got a fascinating background. And, as you know, Wheaton is a liberal arts college, and yet you hear a lot of the STEM talk out there, and it seems like you've lived in both worlds. So I want to explore that as well. When you graduated from Wheaton with a degree in chemistry, what plans did you have for using your chemistry degree?
Well, first of all, the chemistry program at Wheaton is a great program. It's a very strong program, and that was one of the benefits of getting to Wheaton to do that. And I think at that time, I wasn't really sure what I was going to do after starting in industry. And so I had already started working at Kodak, and I thought, well, if I start a job, then I can kind of figure out what I want to do next. I think the majority of my classmates were heading to graduate school for either chemistry PhDs or medical school. And I wasn't ready to figure that out. And so I headed off to Kodak, where I had already been working.
Oh, so are you from the upstate New York area then?
Yeah, I was born in New Jersey, but then my family moved to upstate New York, to Rochester, which is on Lake Ontario, and that is the headquarters of Kodak, where Kodak was started in the 1800s.
Oh my. Now, was it called Eastman Kodak at some point, or is that inaccurate?
No, that's very accurate. Officially, it is the Eastman Kodak Company, and George Eastman is the founder of that. So Eastman is his last name, and he came up with this whole product concept of allowing people to buy cameras and take pictures, send their cameras in, get the pictures developed, and send the camera back with the photos. So it was very innovative and novel at that time, and the start of photography for consumers.
Wow. And as I recall, Rochester was America's first tech concentration, maybe the first Silicon Valley. Is that correct, or is there a place that's even older than Rochester?
Definitely, Rochester could be considered that. Eastman Kodak Company, Xerox, Bausch and Lomb, and other optics and imaging related companies all have had their headquarters there. So it certainly had started out as a really big hub in that technology. And Kodak, even at the time I was joining in 1990, was bringing in the top people from academia.
Yeah, well, it obviously had a great reputation. And then something happened. As I recall, engineers at Kodak invented digital camera technology. Is that
Yeah,
true? And if it's true, when did it happen? And
yeah.
why aren't we awash in Kodak digital cameras?
Well, in fact, it is true. Steve Sasson invented the digital camera at Kodak in 1975. At the time, they called it electronic photography. We didn't call it digital imaging or digital photography. It was first called electronic photography. And then in 1976, another Kodak employee, his name is Bryce Beyer, he invented the Bayer pattern of the digital imaging sensor, which has arrays of red, green, and blue pixels to respond to light. So, yes, you're correct. Um, Digital photography is a very different business than chemical film systems and a very different profit margin for making a company gain revenue. And so electronics, especially at the onset of electronics, the profit margin and the whole business models are very different.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time of this general transition point to digital photography, Kodak was very much involved in it. And what media doesn't normally cover is that actually in the early 2000s, Kodak digital cameras were second in sales numbers only to Canon digital cameras.
Oh my.
Uh, that doesn't really ever seem to show up in the literature or media. But in fact, it is true, particularly in the US market. Kodak digital cameras were second in sales only to Canon. But the model related to business, as well as just the whole infrastructure that Kodak had set up from a chemical imaging systems, certainly has an influence on then how one would proceed to merge into other focuses or related focuses.
So at what point did Kodak start losing market share? I mean, I think Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book called Tipping Point. Was there a tipping point for Kodak in which, beyond that point, it never really recovered its status as one of the biggest digital camera companies in the world?
I think what happens is that the company was really depending on the revenue coming in from the traditional photography, right? So this is an important thing to fund and also balance a new market that has a very different business model and a different requires a lot of change. One of the biggest things that impacted Kodak while I was there was the 9/11 event, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened is, as you might recall, everything kind of went to a standstill and people stopped traveling, people stopped going places, similar to where the COVID pandemic has been to a certain degree, but 9/11 was certainly very globally impacting people's travel, which we had major seasonality to product usage of film and traditional photography related to vacations, graduations, Mother's Day, Father's Day, the holidays, Christmas, Hanukkah, New Year's, these things. And so when the travel stops, then photography actually saw a huge halt. And that really did impact then the timing and the whole digital photography transition.
Wow. I had no idea. It's interesting. We're 21 years after 9/11. It had all these tentacles and things that it affected.
Correct.
It's just
Yeah.
remarkable. I've not heard that before. So I see that the Munsell Color Science Laboratory helped sponsor you for your advanced degrees. Can you tell us what the term color science means?
Well, it was a new term to me myself when I was first introduced to it. So when I started at Kodak, they placed me in a rotation program for their top incoming technical employees. So the 24 of us were placed in a 2-year training program and then rotated through work assignments within the corporation. Part of that training included training at Rochester Institute of Technology. in the Munsell Color Science Lab. So it was very new to me. I was working as a chemical spectroscopist at the time. So that relates to spectral properties of chemicals. But I hadn't been thinking about spectral properties of chemistry or chemicals with respect to perception and human visual system detection. So color science, as they generated the program, is interdisciplinary, and
Hmm.
it relates to the physics of color, which relate to the wavelengths of color, but it also relates to the psychophysics of color, or the psychology and perceptual elements of color. And so elements of perceptual psychology and doing user studies or psychophysical studies are part of the program. So color, because it's both physics and perception and art, has this integrated element to it. And so they came up with the term color science.
Wow, it's a lot more in depth than I thought. That's really remarkable. Uh, can you explain in layperson's terms how a digital camera works?
Yeah, sure. I had mentioned about this gentleman at Kodak, Bryce Beyer, who invented the Beyer pattern. So a sensor is part of a digital photography pathway, and the sensor is what responds to light. So a photograph is taking an image of light that is either shining or reflecting toward the camera. And so the light goes through optics that relate to the lens, and the light goes through the lens, and then it can be focused on this Bayer pattern or image sensor, and it has red, green, and blue pixel sensitivity. And those three color behaviors can be then combined to provide the full color behavior of light, because light is made up of all kinds of wavelengths. Those wavelengths then are detected differently by the red, green, and blue pixels on the image sensor. And after that light happens and there's electron motion going on in the electronics, that signal then gets passed on and can be interpreted and put into a display. And the display screen itself also has red, green, and blue pixels that make up the display screen. So there's this mathematical transformation that happens once the light is converted into digital numbers. And those numbers then proceed from the sensor to then the display. And because the pixels are small enough, when we look at that, then that all gets integrated by our vision to perceive what is that image that we just took a picture of.
Wow. So this doesn't sound, I don't hear any chemistry in this. I hear physics and I hear other science. Uh, did your chemistry background prepare you for all this? Because it sounds like you were operating outside what you studied at Wheaton.
Uh, to back up a little bit, the short answer is yes to your question. In fact, I started as an environmental chemist at Kodak,
Okay.
and I worked in the chemistry labs, and I was doing chemical analysis of water, air, and soil related to the chemical makeup of those, and ensuring that Kodak was meeting both state regulations and national regulations for chemical treatment and chemical release. So that's where I started. But as I mentioned, I was placed in this 2-year training program right away at Kodak. And that's where I started that educational training and learning process to move from the environmental chemistry into film and paper chemistry, and then into electronic and digital photography, and then into the detailed elements of color science.
Is this something you asked for, or did your supervisors ask you to do this?
It's an interesting story. There was the existing program at Kodak, and I had heard of it, but I hadn't applied for it. And within the first month, probably, or quarter, I was to present as the new chemist. I was to present to our division director And so I presented my research to the division director that I had already started during the summers when I was there, and while a Wheaton intern as a student. And then I was called into the director's office and told, we are placing you in this training program. We put in 1 or 2 people a year from our division, and you're going to be the person representing our division, and welcome to Kodak.
So this was an honor. I mean, you got picked obviously because of performance and aptitude. It wasn't the luck of the draw.
I would say that's correct, yes. And certainly the timing of having a presentation at the timing of when this
Yes.
program would start, because I started right after Wheaton graduation, within a month, I guess, or less maybe. And this program, I believe, started in the fall. So I think then I would have presented within that summer timeframe. And then, yeah, it was exciting. And my coworkers made a joke of it because I think back to the 1990s in corporate America, especially on the East Coast. This was the land of button-down shirts and ties, and I showed up to this meeting in my polo shirt, and people were saying, "Oh, if you ever have a meeting with the division director, you're supposed to be in business with a tie." So they said, just think of what position you would have been given had you worn a button-down shirt with a tie.
Yeah, you'll never know the answer to that question.
Correct.
But in a way, you kind of that was a prophetic attire for you because, as you know, in the West Coast, everybody dresses
That's correct.
extremely casually.
Active wear is the fashion of the West Coast. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, fascinating. So I want to ask you maybe one more question about Eastman Kodak because I remember taking my camera and taking out the film and dropping it by the developer and waiting. As recently as
correct.
maybe 20 years ago, we'd go to Costco and drop it in. It'd be a whole sea of people's developed film waiting and have to wade through it. But so Kodak was good to you. They trained you. They gave you a wonderful background for what followed. So I think when most people hear the term Google, they think of knowledge. They think of information. They think of the world leader in search engines. And yet you did camera work. You work on the Pixel. Can you explain how Google got into the camera business?
I see. Yeah, it's an interesting transition that Google chose. And it had started before I got to Google. There was the Google Nexus line of smartphones. And I think because I wasn't there, I don't know the history as well as I know Kodak history. But Google had purchased the Android operating system, and that is what runs the computer processing within a smartphone product. And so I think naturally that then led to the Google Nexus, which was a precursor to the Google Pixel smartphone line. And so when I joined Google, I was brought in to be a team of experts that would consult throughout the company for any product that was putting a camera in it. So it was to be like a resource of expert consultants within the company. And then what happened is Motorola had been purchased by Google, then they sold it, and then Motorola went to ASUS, I believe, and the CEO of Motorola, Rick Osterloh, was hired by Google to then start a very focused hardware portfolio,
Mhm.
which hadn't the hardware products of Google before that point of transition had not been uh, being produced as a family of products and not on the same kind of calendar. So there wasn't like a formal launch year, a point of the time in the year. So when Rick Osterloh then was brought in, he formed the organization that said, we're going to make a hardware family, and everyone brought their products to him so he could review them and get an idea of what he wanted to make for the hardware portfolio of Google.
Wow. Wow. So, can you describe what the Google culture was like to you? Because you were an East Coast guy and you worked
Yes.
for a company that was a lot older than than Google, and then you're on the sudden you're on the West Coast working for a new company that's having explosive growth.
Yeah. Well, I'll also insert there that when I started on the West Coast, I first started at NVIDIA. So
I'm sorry. Yes, that's right.
yeah, no, but it's just more to give you some transition information. So NVIDIA was certainly the first step into that. And I had already been going to Silicon Valley a lot for meetings because I've been involved in international photography standards all along. And the involvement of companies in that standard had expanded to include the new electronics companies such as Google and Apple and Motorola beyond the traditional photography companies. So we had many meetings with these standards associations within Silicon Valley. So thankfully, again, because of Kodak's influence in my life, I had already been working with that, and we were doing projects with cameras and smartphones. So NVIDIA first hired me because they were putting this Tegra chip into smartphones, and the ISP stands for image signal processing, and that chip handles the data that is collected by the sensor and then is turned into the JPEG photo or the video file. So I learned a lot by going and working at NVIDIA. Then I did get recruited into Google. I have a funny story to say. You're talking about the contrast of the East Coast, West Coast. So I went to Google because of an individual who is a famous person related to sensors who had been is very influential in the sensors technology field, and he had been a CTO prior to joining Google and then hired me. So but he did pull me aside at one of my early meetings and say, I just want you to know that you have a very nice clothing wardrobe, I guess he would have said. But he said, I do want to point out that the fashion here on the West Coast is very different. And if you're looking to be more acclimated to the Google culture, you should be looking at your wardrobe relative to what other people are wearing. So it was kind of a unique conversation. And I said, well, I have been, I'm new to Google. Thanks for pointing that out. What I noticed is they're the Google Android robots that are kind of these are caricatures of people, but in robotic form for the Android organization. And I said, I have noticed that they're all different sizes and shapes, and they wear different fashion, and I'm happy to help Google also understand diversity from other parts of the US and other parts of the world.
Nice. Yeah, so you were told to dress down, in other words.
Yes, I was. I was told that my attire was a bit formal. But the funny thing is, going from the days of Kodak when it was button-down shirts and ties and very, quite proper, to what I was wearing, I felt was quite casual, to even the West Coast standards was still too formal.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, I mean, I've always maintained that a well-made suit is as comfortable as a pair of jeans and a t-shirt, but that's neither here nor there. So how did you like working at Google? Because you were there a number of years.
I was there. Google went through a lot of changes from when I started to when I decided to leave. When I started, it was really amazing because I was going in, as I said, to be part of this expert consultant team. It was 15 of us that were hand chosen to be the experts in our various elements of camera technology, and it was truly pinch me, I'm dreaming, because I pulled into the underground parking lot under the Googleplex of the center of Google's headquarters and pressed the elevator button, and it opened up, and that my desk was literally right in front of the elevator on the third floor where I started my first job. So that was amazing, and I loved it. It was great. And then the person who I went to go work for directly, he moved on to become a CTO of another company and returned to the CTO role because that wasn't his role at Google precisely. So then the whole organization and structure and pathways of Google really changed. So the initial connection with that group of experts to then how things really changed, then my whole experience really diverged from what I originally thought the role was going to be there. So after working on the launch of the Google Pixel smartphone and working on the cameras for 3 years, the Android organization kept being given my name as the person they should hire in a new effort related to the display of the actual phone displays. So it was a good timing for me when they were still wanting to start this new effort. And so I moved to that area display. And I think Google fundamentally is a software company. So then I was in the Android organization, which is an operating system.
Mm.
So then the justification or the reasoning for being at Google kind of changed and
Sure.
dissipated from my original entrance. Yeah, but I was very happy. I worked for 3 years on the cameras of the Pixel smartphone and then 3 years on the displays of the Pixel smartphone.
So I'm starting to see smartphones that are advertising 48 megapixel resolution, and I just saw one that said 200, which doesn't seem possible. Can you explain to us what is why would you want to buy a smartphone with a camera with that capability? I'm not sure I understand why.
And yeah, it's a great question. So if just to kind of explain what is happening, if you think of a sensor as being a square, that is what is detecting the light, and then you think of dividing it up in a grid. And so original starting points, even on digital cameras, were about three megapixel cameras. So you divide up your grid and then you go to 8 megapixel and 12 megapixel and 48 megapixel and 200. So those pixels then become smaller, 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 and smaller. So the technology has to then enable that to happen because, in fact, those pixels become smaller than the wavelengths of light. So
Oh,
the pixels now start having the light waves that are coming in are bigger than those little pixels themselves.
oh
So
my.
yeah, so then they do pixel binning and they can do processing to then allow for the imaging process to create what could be a better quality photograph. So I think part of it is the challenge for people to say, hey, we can do this, and also looking then how you can revisit. So yes, there could be all those pixels, but they become so small, they're smaller than the wavelengths of light. So then you end up doing clustering and other ways of doing the combination. So there then could be things related to efficiency where each pixel is carrying less information. But I haven't been working in the camera sensors more recently as this has happened. I've been working in the display area.
I see.
Yeah, but there's definitely this trend, and you have to do these kind of binning or these kind of combination of these pixel arrays.
So I know you know what Moore's law is.
Yes.
Is there an equivalent for imaging that they'll get every year or so the size of pixels will grow that much more or anything like that?
That's yeah, it could be. We did have the era when before it went to these 50 megapixel and higher, there was that whole concept of 3 and then 5 and then 8 and when will companies move to 12 and etc. So that was happening for a while and then things kind of leveled out. Everyone kind of stuck at around 12
Hmm.
megapixels because that's where the hardware had matured. But now to get to these higher arrays, like the arrays of many more pixels, it's a different process to make those kind of sensor devices. So I think I would say we would have like cycles of this Moore's law because the hardware is changing too. So it could apply. It probably does apply. I haven't done the actual modeling myself.
Sure, sure. No, I was just curious because I take a lot of pictures with my smartphone. Do you think um, that smartphone imagery has overtaken cameras? I mean, do you think cameras are obsolete now, or is there still a place for the traditional point and shoot camera?
There's definitely still a value in the traditional camera, but the strengths and needs are, I think, differ now. Originally, as you can probably remember, with the flip phone cameras and things were just not really great quality. And because of the technological transitions happening. So cameras now are putting in, the smartphones are now putting in optical zoom. And I know some of the latest I've been looking at 5x optical zoom, getting even maybe a little bit higher. But if you go to the optics of a digital single lens reflex or digital SLR, your optical zoom has been much more than that for a very long time. So a 5x zoom lens on a digital camera, even from 10 to 20 years ago, and the optics of these large single lens reflex DSLR, they're going to be by far more capable because the optics are so much more designed and have more space. They're not these tiny little optics. So it allows you to have that flexibility. But what the traditional camera processing doesn't have is the very strong and powerful computational photography, is what it's called, to do the processing of those pixels once they become mathematical numbers. And so the algorithms and the image processing that can happen through a smartphone camera are by far more capable of the typical system in a digital camera. So you end up with a much better rendering of high dynamic range, which relates to the the range from very, very dark parts of an image to very, very bright parts of an image, like fluffy white clouds. So in general, you can see a lot more detail in the whole range of black to white in a smartphone, whereas a digital camera, a lot of that from a professional standpoint would be done in a software application offline and is not in the automated pipeline of the product itself.
All right. So just a few more questions, and then I'll be done. So um, you're right now. Your present position is in image quality testing and
Yes,
imaging science. Can you tell
yes.
me what imaging science means?
Sure. I think it relates to how we modify terminology over time as the technologies change and mature. So the program at our IT Rochester Institute of Technology originally was photographic sciences. But if we think about photography, it is a subset of a much larger scope that can include remote imaging for satellite imagery or for thermal imaging for things that we can't see but heat properties. And so if we were to just use photographic science, then it would not include these other elements of detection and relating to radiation beyond the visible radiation. So then imaging became used because it can relate to a broader area of photography beyond the professional or consumer photography. And the science aspect is because it relates to physics of light and digital imaging, digital numbers, and how we handle those numbers once we have a digital form of what used to be the analog image on film.
Wow. Yeah. So as you know, I have a federal law enforcement background, and I do know that there is some imaging technology that actually lets the officer penetrate the skin of a building and see if there's heat signature, infrared signature coming from inside of the building, and therefore that those signatures are people. Um, so that would be included in the rubric of imaging science. Is that right?
Correct, correct. As opposed to a photographic device, it's a device that's going beyond the traditional detection that we would call photography.
Yeah. Well, this has been a real mind blower for me, Jonathan. I think my brain has expanded just talking to you and listening to your explanations. So, we've been talking. You've been talking about a lot of science processes and technology. We've not really talked about what Wheaton stands for, which is a faith in Christ. And I always ask my guests, how has your faith in Christ impact your work? And in some areas, it's direct. In this, can you explain how your religious beliefs affect your work? Because you're in a highly technical field that not that many people know much about.
That's a great question. And I was part of efforts at Google related to people who do value their faith and um, participated in discussions and bringing in invited guests and authors on the topic of religion.
Mhm.
And pretty recently, after a lot of effort with Google, there was an interbelief network that was formally recognized and established. As one can imagine, with the name of interbelief network, it's more than just Christianity, right?
Right.
But the fact was that it took time and energy, but to get Google to recognize that for many people, their belief system is an important part. And if
Sure.
Google, yeah, and if Google is saying they're hiring you as your full self, then they need to understand that for many people, that includes a belief system. So it was really rewarding to be part of those discussions and network with people within Google around the world. So there's a very direct element of in the interpersonal interaction with other Google employees on that topic. And then from my own personal self, time in reflection and thinking through my life and what is my identity through Christ and what examples did he provide for us when I'm looking at how I'm living my life. That becomes really important. And I think going to Google after having been at Kodak and very established in a career there and becoming an employee of a similarly large 150,000 corporation like Kodak was when I started, it was interesting then to delve into that and reflect on the element of humility
Mm.
and really realizing that for Christ as deity to become human and form, what humility that is, and to be in an environment of Google, which, as you can imagine, with amazing, talented people, that I reflect on humility a lot during my time at Google.
Wow. Yeah, I think humility is something that doesn't come easy to accomplish people, or whatever the field is, and it's really encouraging to hear you say that. So I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to me about this exciting world. My last question is this, Jonathan. Uh, Wheaton students end up doing all kinds of things. If there is a Wheaton student who's listening to this podcast, what advice would you give them if they're interested in doing the kind of work that you've been blessed to do?
Oh, that's a great question. I thoroughly enjoyed my experience at Wheaton with the work I did in both chemistry and in music at the conservatory. And I would really advise the student to look at what they've learned not only in their major, but in all of their courses, and including their classes related to religion and philosophy, sociology, if those aren't their fields, or the classes that the students had outside of that. Just really reflect on that and the value that can give you in perspective, whatever field you choose. And it does allow you to move into other areas that may not be directly aligned with your original degree program.
So, in other words, be flexible.
Be flexible. Yes.
Yeah. So I'll just end this podcast by saying I have this saying that all my overseas study students have to learn. It's called Semper Gumby.
Mm.
And if you are old enough to remember the little Gumby character,
Oh, yes.
the little
Yeah.
green, the little green guy, uh,
Yeah.
his most uh, obvious characteristic is he's flexible. And I tell my
Interesting.
students, when you travel, you have to be flexible. In life, you have to be flexible because you can have a plan, but God may have a completely different plan. And you've got to be flexible enough to seek the plan that God has for you. Jonathan Phillips, thank you so much for your time. This has been a wonderful time, and I appreciate it.
Oh, you're very welcome, David. So nice to be on your blog.
You have been listening to Wheaton's Center for Faith, Politics, and Economics podcast. 3 Things with host David Iglesias. Join us again in 2 weeks for a new interview with an accomplished faith, political, and business leader.